So I'm just waiting for people to. Okay, I think I'll kick off now. And sorry, hello. This is I'm David Gow. Welcome to the latest in our webinars for the European movement in Scotland. And tonight we're discussing the Sunday's election, the second round of the French presidential elections, which will see the current incumbent Emmanuel Macron take on, as in 2017, Marine Le Pen. Except this time, it looks as if the last time he won by effectively 66%, sorry, to 34% in 2017. But this time it looks a lot closer. And so we'll be looking at what the prospects are for this election, but also discussing what the future, what the implications are for Europe and for the future of Europe. Very similar in a sense to, in a way, what the discussion we had back in September when we had, obviously we discussed the elections, the Bundestagswahl in Germany, and that was a pretty pivotal election and saw some significant change. And this could be similar. So anyway, so can I just ask those of you who are watching to and taking part, or will be taking part, when it comes to the Q&A, can you please put your questions in the Q&A channel and not in the chat? Do please use the chat for chat, but not for Q&A. And if you like, some of you, you can kind of effectively vote for kind of things, which particular questions you like, and I'll keep in touch with those and keep watching that very carefully. Anyway, so we know what what's happening. As we were just saying before we started, there's a big televised debate in France tomorrow evening, which, if it's anything like 2017, could be decisive. But certainly things are very much tighter now than they were 5 years ago. So first of all, so we're joined by a very privileged to be joined by a very distinguished panel, and of John Henley from The Guardian, John Lichfield, an old colleague of mine from the old days at one point in the Scotsman and then in the Independent, Assa Samaké-Roman, who was a freelance journalist, French journalist living in Leith, and David O'Sullivan, who has got many strings to his bow, put it mildly, and is actually now currently just appointed. It wasn't a very auspicious day, April Fool's Day. But anyway, from April the 1st, he became Director General, I think it is, Director of the Irish Institute for International and European Affairs. Would that we had one in Scotland. Anyway, voila. Okay. Well, over to you, John, to start to kick us off. You said that in the one of the last pieces I saw for you, the headline was about in terms of Marine Le Pen, Frexit in all but name is what she represents. Anyway, voila. Over to you. Give us your take on what's happening.
Thanks.
What we could expect.
Thanks very much, David, and very happy to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm going to get a bit of a rundown of sort of where we are first, and then a bit of an idea of what the consequences might be for Europe, depending obviously on which way it goes. So, as you said, David, first round of voting is now over. There were a dozen candidates, and the incumbent, Emmanuel Macron, and Marine Le Pen, his far-right challenger, are the two who went through on roughly, bless you, John, on roughly 28% and 23% respectively. which was a slightly better score for Macron than many had predicted, and seemed to show even last Sunday that the momentum that Marine Le Pen had built up over the previous few weeks seemed to be slowing. She ran. I mean, I think even her fiercest opponent would concede, ran a very, very smart campaign, which came on top of a sort of multi-annual campaign or a long-standing campaign to try and detoxify the image of her party and remove it from this sort of jackbooted, neo-fascist kind of National Front, racist sort of all the baggage that the Le Pen family name carried with it. She's been trying to detoxify the party for years and also to soften up her own personal image. And on top of that, she ran a campaign that was focused really, absolutely from the start, on kind of cost of living issues and the cost of living crisis, and she really focused on that. And the timing of it was absolutely perfect. Macron got this quite a considerable bounce, a kind of rally around the flag bounce with the beginning of the war in Ukraine, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And even a month ago, it looked like he was going to walk it with a sort of a 20-point gap between the two in the polls. But in the sort of 2 or 3 weeks immediately running up to the first round, Le Pen succeeded in really significantly narrowing that gap to sort of well into the single figures. And it was, as I think John called it at one stage, it was looking sort of a bit like squeaky bum time, and it looked like the curves might cross, but they didn't. As I said, Macron won by about 28 points and Le Pen about 23. So there's a sort of a 4.5, 5-point gap between them in the end, which was more than predicted. And since then, the polls, just to talk about the polling for a little minute, seem to show that Macron is kind of consolidating his lead. I mean, the polls just before first round vote, polls for the second round, the smallest gap between the two leading candidates was, shrank to as little as 3 points, which is sort of within the margin of error, basically. And it started to look very, very alarming. That the actual average of the polls now is around about 8 or 9 points, and there have been several recent polls, one today as well and one yesterday, both of which had projected Macron to win by a margin of 12 percentage points, which is, may not be comfortable, but is considerably more comfortable than it looked a week ago. And why is that happening? I mean, I think it's quite interesting. I think in the first round, Le Pen benefited a lot from being able to sort of hide behind, or she was effectively shielded by her far right rival Eric Zemmour, who is this, sort of rabidly, anti-Islam, anti-immigrant, and very virulent TV pundit. And his positions were so extreme on everything to do with Islam and immigration that she actually began to look quite reasonable, certainly on those topics at least. And he effectively distracted the media attention and a lot of the public attention to such an extent that all we kind of saw of Marine Le Pen was this sort of smooth smile that she has managed to give herself over the last few years. And that kind of really saw her through the first round. And although she was, I'm sure John will talk about this, but she was pushed very hard in the end by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left candidate. But to focus on her, she was effectively shielded by Zemmour, and what we saw was her smile. And since the start of the second round, there's been an awful lot more scrutiny. I mean, the scrutiny on the concrete measures that she's proposing. The French media have finally started looking at the detail of her manifesto, and have started to see quite how dramatic it is, as Le Monde called it, superficially a kind of, an affable, exterior, but fundamentally a classically and quite dramatically far-right program, which contains a lot. I mean, lots of things, individual things to point out of, a economically an absolute disaster. The 2014 French Nobel Prize winner for economics this weekend called it a catastrophic and hugely dangerous, and it would irreparably damage France. I mean, we're talking about, broadly speaking, on the economy, some of the kind of measures that we probably haven't seen since the 1970s Labour in Britain. Very, very interventionist, kind of price controls and wage controls, and and also, according to the 2014 Nobel Economics Prize winner, the cost of which have been underestimated by something like 68 billion euros. So there's that to have a go at. It's pretty hopeless on the environment, on green issues. She wants to rip out all the wind turbines that are built in France and ban building any more. But I think that the thing that has shocked people the most, I think, is this bill that she wants to introduce, and she said she'll introduce it, within a matter of months after being elected, if she's elected, on citizenship, identity, and immigration. And she plans to push this bill through by referendum, because otherwise she would need parliamentary and Senate approval for it, which she would be highly unlikely to get, I think. But this is really a genuinely shockingly far-right program, and it would introduce what she calls a national priority, which is basically a national preference for French citizens, and it would enshrine discrimination against non-French nationals and dual nationals, even people who've lived in France for many, many years and have dual nationality. It would enshrine in the French constitution discrimination against those people in jobs, in housing, in welfare benefits, in the works, and that's shocked a lot of people. It would mean, for example, that families that immigrated into France decades ago could be thrown out of their subsidized housing when the leases ran out, and that kind of thing. And that has shocked a lot of people, and I think that's probably what lies behind this, this change in the shift in dynamic in the polls. So it's looking at, a lot better for Macron than it did. But I think in terms of the consequences for Europe, quite obviously, I called it Frexit in all but name, because some people are calling it Frexit by stealth. And I don't think you can call it Frexit by stealth, because I don't think it's Marine Le Pen's aim to go for a full-blown Frexit, to actually deliberately pull France out of the European Union as Britain did with Brexit. Apart from this, I think it would be, I think for a country that uses the euro, I think the consequence, I think it's just the practical difficulties of that are almost unimaginable. But it is a kind of a Frexit in all but name, in the sense that almost, there are many of her policies on the economy, on immigration, on citizenship, the ones that I've just mentioned, that are clearly incompatible with EU membership, and would bring France into the kind of conflictual relationship with the EU27 and with Brussels that Hungary and Poland have at the moment. There would be immense kind of rule of law issues. I mean, to name just, I mean, the whole idea of having a national preference is clearly violates not just sort of EU values, but EU rules around freedom of movement, and not not to mention violating the principles of equality in the French Constitution and the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and all the rest of it. And there are other things that she wants to do that also bring her into conflict with Europe. For example, she wants to reimpose border controls on goods and people, which is clearly, in breach of the Schengen Agreement and again the freedom of free movement rules. She wants to unilaterally cut France's contribution to the EU budget. Despite the fact that the framework's been agreed for the next and up until 2027, she plans to introduce cut taxes rather on essential goods, VAT, and also cut fuel taxes. All of these would put her into conflict with the EU straight away. And I think the consequences of that, obviously, for the EU would be really dramatic, in the sense that the kind of standoff that the EU has at the moment with Hungary and Poland is one thing, but if you were to, I mean, it's difficult to conceive of a more damaging standoff than with a country that's a founder member of the European Union. It's the second largest economy in Europe, and obviously it's one half of the famous sort of Franco-German engine that's powered the EU from the start. So it would be an absolutely, really, those consequences would be absolutely dramatic. There's one just brief point, the final point. There is a severe question over how much she could actually get done of this program. She would need the parliamentary elections that will follow the second round will be critical in who gets a majority or not. Whether or not her proposed referendum to introduce this citizenship and identity law would be deemed constitutional by the Constitutional Council is a serious question. But if she gets in, the consequences would clearly be very serious for Europe. Thankfully, as I said, it looks at the moment like Macron is edging his way to victory. But that same qualifying remark that I just made about the parliamentary elections obviously applies to him. He will need a parliamentary majority. He will need to cobble together some kind of working majority, which may involve some compromises. And so I think the likelihood of him being able to put in place his vision of Europe, which we've obviously been familiar with for the past 5 years, will be significantly limited.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that excellent tour d'horizon, and and actually it's very interesting when you talk about Le Pen's effective bill on identity and so on. It sounds remarkably like Priti Patel, but anyway, over here. So anyway, so over to you, Assa. Thanks for. I should have said, by the way, folks, that John, of course, has been for a long-standing Guardian correspondent in Paris, and then subsequently now Europe is his oyster, I think, is it not? From yeah. Anyway, over to you, Assa. You began. I mean, as far as Scotland is concerned, you kind of came here, I think, as an Erasmus student, which is the subject very close to the heart of EMIS, since we're campaigning very hard for Scotland to rejoin EMIS, whether it's part of the UK or on its own, but certainly as soon as possible. It's extremely damaging to us and our young people to be excluded from it. But so anyway, so you did a year in Edinburgh, I know, as an Erasmus student, and you kind of, I assume you had a kind of coup de foudre for l'Écosse.
Absolutely.
And because you live here now, and you live in the kind of go young person's place of Leith, biscuit factory, you tell me. where inter alia, you cover French-Scottish politics for various French media. And most intriguing, and you've written a book already called Écossaise, Adrien, I take it, obviously, et la licorne, and the unicorn, our national emblem, and published in November 2020. And you co-produced Écosse Toujours, d'accord, and you're working on the launch of La Revue Écossaise, a magazine
Right,
about Scotland in French. Well, bonne chance. I hope you have a big audience for that. Anyway,
thank you very much.
I hope too that, I mean, are you, let's talk about what we're here to talk about, which is Macron, Le Pen, et l'Europe. Are you quite as, John sounds, with a couple of little caveats, he sounds relatively sanguine about Sunday's outcome. Are you?
I think it's fair to say that I feel a bit nervous about how Sunday is going to unfold, simply because, so obviously I don't live in France now, so I think my perspective is quite different from the perspectives of the other panelists. Also, I talked to a lot of people my age and my sister's age. So my sister is 20 years old. And I know a lot of people on Sunday are just not going to bother to go to the polls. They're not going to vote. I know a lot of people who voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, so he's the radical left candidate, not necessarily because they love him, but just because he was the best placed to be in the second round and beat Marine Le Pen in the second round and face Emmanuel Macron. Obviously, that didn't happen. He arrived a few points behind Marine Le Pen, even though in the night following the first round, for a few hours, people kind of believed that maybe there was, a chance that Jean-Luc Mélenchon could face Emmanuel Macron, but that didn't materialize. I think he was missing something like 400,000 votes, so that was quite substantial. And a big part of his electorate, he's actually feeling quite fed up with le Front républicain, faire barrage. So that means basically voting for the candidate by standing in front of the far right, and they just don't want to do it. They think that, Emmanuel Macron was essentially not a centrist for 5 years. He was right-wing. He despised the left for 5 years. So why would he come now and ask for the left support to be re-elected for the presidency for 5 years? So, some people are not going to vote. Some people are going to vote for Emmanuel Macron reluctantly. There's a sizable part also of Mélenchon's electorate that is going to vote for Marine Le Pen. I think it's in the latest polls, it's about 1 in 5, I think. So anything could happen on Sunday, really. I'm notoriously bad for pronostics. I didn't see Brexit coming, for example. I was thinking, oh, they would never do that. The Brits would never leave us alone. And look what happened. So I'm not risking anything. I'm not going to jinx it. But I think tonight, what I want to talk to you about is simply where I come from, because I think it's quite representative of the situation in France. So I'm originally from a small town in rural France, in the center of the country, called Issoudun. It's about 12,000 inhabitants. It's very working class. My father used to work in the local factory. My mother is a nurse. The city center, you can see shops with wooden boards. A lot of things have closed in the past 10, 15 years. The maternity has closed. The police station has closed. There are fewer trains. There's sustainable population decline. It's a medical desert as well. My mother, for example, cannot find a GP. She can't find a dentist either. I remember I had to wait up to a year to see someone to renew my glasses, my prescriptions for my glasses. It used to be a big socialist stronghold. So the current mayor has been in office for the past, I think, 30, 35 years. So some areas of France, you can see people holding to power for that long. But what we can see, what we've seen since, I would say, 2007, is the far right just creeping up more and more, because people feel a sense of decline. They feel a sense that they're forgotten. They feel a sense that really, there's no state anymore. The state's power is just receding. So they're veering to the far right, not necessarily because they're full-blown racist, even though you can see the occasional committed racist, at school, at work, etc. but just because they're fed up with everything and they're feeling disenfranchised. You can also see that people go less and less to the polls, so you can see abstention is rising consistently. I think one of the big problems for the people in this area of France and in so many areas of France is obviously the cost of living. They have been quite mobilized with les gilets jaunes, so the yellow jackets, just because, for example, with the price of fuel, it is impacting standards of living very consistently. So because you need your car to get anywhere, they feel that they do not really have any perspectives, and actually young people just like me leave because, you know, there's no work, they can't stay there for their higher education. And what you can see as well is that the old traditional parties, they tend to disappear as well. So you get the socialists, for example, they went from running the country until 5 years ago to, you know, barely being able to pay back their campaign expenses, even though the socialists anticipated that they were going to have a very bad score. But when you look at Les Républicains, so that was Nicolas Sarkozy's party, they are in, you know, dire straits, really. Valérie Pécresse, their candidate, I think she's indebted to the levels of 5 million euros. So she's calling for donations to really help the financial future of the party. And the Greens as well. I don't think they expected to fare so miserably in this election. They got under 5% of the vote. And if you have under 5% of the votes in the French presidential election, that means that you actually have to pay for your campaign expenses yourself. So that's a lot of money to pay back. So where did all these voters go? All the voters who used to vote for the socialists or for Les Républicains. So a lot of them went to Macron, obviously. So he's kind of the center ground candidate. So people who maybe identify with, you know, social democratic, social liberal ideas. Back in 2017, they thought that Macron would probably be the, you know, the best compromise. So a lot of them are still with him. Some turned to Mélenchon, as I said, not just because they love Jean-Luc Mélenchon and they identify with his radical policies, but just because, you know, it's a vote utile. So that means that you are voting tactically to have at least a chance of having the left in the second round. Some turn obviously to the far right and Marine Le Pen just because they want to have a protest vote, and you have people who just abstain and feel that, you know, they're not really given a choice. They don't really have a power in this election. So what's now? So obviously, I think one of the conclusions that a lot of people are drawing is that the system is just not working. So the first round is supposed to be a kind of expression of people's real thoughts and real aspirations for the country. So they choose between a dozen candidates. So this year there were 12. There have been elections where there have been many more candidates, for example, like in 2002. And the second round, this is when you decide between two and, you know, you make compromises. But now a lot of voters feel that they have to make sure there's no risk that the far right is going to get anywhere near power. So you're not really expressing what you want. So that means that it's not working really well. And even if Le Pen loses next week, she won't lose by a huge margin like in 2017. And that is bound to change the country forever. This is bound to change the center ground of the country. And if she wins, you know, it's not just going to be for 5 years. When the far right gets in, I think it stays for a very, very long time. Especially for an election that is as important as the presidential election. I don't know who said the other day on Twitter, it's like giving a chance to someone to make a mark on history. So it's not just, you know, a fixed period of time. And I think it changes the country forever, really. So personally, I know journalists don't tend to say a lot about their opinions, but, you know, my full name is Assa Samaké-Roman. I came to France when I was a little baby. I became French when I was 7 years old. And these people on the far right, they're never going to consider me French enough, you know, Française de papier, meaning that, you know, there are true French people and false French people. And I think in the face of xenophobia, of racism, it's just plain wrong to remain silent. So I really do hope that on Sunday, we won't have, you know, a far right racist president who, even though she shows her cats on TikToks for likes, still is a far right candidate, and she doesn't want to be called like that. She wants to soften her image, and I think to a certain point she's managed to do that. I think a lot of polls are showing that people are just not scared of the far right anymore. They don't really see that as a big catastrophe, so they want maybe to take a chance. But this is something that we might come to regret if Marine Le Pen comes to power. Obviously, in June, we're going to have more elections. There's the parliamentary elections. We're going to elect our MPs to sit in the National Assembly. So this is also going to be interesting, because if Macron wins, will he manage to get a majority? He needs a working majority to be able to govern the country for the next 5 years. If Marine Le Pen wins, can she also get some majority? Can she govern with? What are people going to do? Are people still going? So those who voted for Mélenchon, for example, are they going to still give him that kind of support? So it is an equally important election. So this is going to be a very interesting few weeks indeed.
So thank you very, very much indeed. Yeah, and it's I think it's what you say, so passionately is absolutely very, very important and well said. And thank you very much indeed. Now, John, before moving on, John, you were at one point a Scotsman journalist in London and indeed in Brussels, and then so you worked for there, and I think you were the Paris correspondent. You outdid John actually in a way. I mean, he was only there for 10 years. You did 20. Good Lord. I mean, and of course you won a kind of I think you won the kind of Foreign Journalist of the Year. Did you not win the UK Press Award back in the kind of late 90s? I remember it well. So a very distinguished career, and now you worked also in Washington as well, I think, did you not? So you have to unmute yourself, mon cher collègue.
I'm sorry, yes, I did 5 years in Washington.
Yes, and so anyway, along a very distinguished career, and now you live in Calvados, in Normandy. So which is probably a pretty good choice actually. But one of the last pieces you wrote a piece for, I think about a week ago, and actually you write a lot for Unheard, I think, and others as well, and Politico, of course, as well. And you said that but anyway, you wrote a piece for The Guardian, and it was headline, "Get ready for a scary fortnight in French politics. A Le Pen presidency really is possible." It's so. Would you write it again today?
No.
Okay.
I didn't. I mean, the headline was The Guardian's headline, not mine. No,
that old canard, blame the subs.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. No, at that point, as John and Assa have very eloquently described, at that point, the campaign did become very squeaky bum time. It did look as if Le Pen was surging, and the second round polls were very close. I never thought Le Pen would win, and I said so in that piece, but I said that you can never absolutely exclude an accident if the polls get very close. I would say that I'd be slightly different from John in saying that I think Le Pen's first round campaign was very, very good one, but I think she benefited from Eric Zemmour's presence in the campaign in a different sort of way, which is that at some point, at about the time the Ukraine war began, the far-right voters who had piled in behind Eric Zemmour poured out from Eric Zemmour and came into her. And if you look at the combined far-right vote in the first round, it had been very high, too high, 30-31% for weeks and weeks and weeks. And about 15%, 16% for Zemmour, same for Le Pen. And a lot of that vote left Zemmour and came to Le Pen, and it gave her a sense of momentum, a surge. She came right up to 22, 23%. He went down finally to 7%. It looked as if she was surging ahead, but she wasn't taking votes from anyone else. She wasn't taking votes from Macron or the other the left, or even the centre-right candidate. She was taking it from Zemmour. So it gave this kind of impression of momentum and surge. And I think momentum creates momentum. What was more serious was the fact that the second round polls were coming very close, where she'd been 8-10 points behind. Macron came within a couple of points. She's now 12-13 points behind again. And it was inevitable, as John Henley described very well, that once people started to look at her extraordinary programme, that she would start to lose ground, which is exactly what has happened. So let me say now, Macron will win on Sunday. It won't be 66-34. It might be by at least double figures. It might be by 10-12 points that he wins, depending a little bit on the debate tomorrow, but I don't think the debate will be decisive. It might shift points here or there. She'll obviously do better than her disastrous performance last time, so the expectations will work in her favour. All the same, I think this is going to be a fairly comfortable win for Macron. What I would like to do, because it's been very passionately described by Assa and very, very accurately described by John, I don't want to go over that same ground too much, but what I'd like to do, because I think this is the more important point from a European point of view, is situate this election in a wider framework, because we are, I think, in the middle of a kind of series of 3 French elections. This is going to be the middle one, which will completely transform, is already completely transforming French politics, and may, unfortunately, cause real problems for Europe eventually, because I think what is happening is a huge shift in the political landscape in France, which is not going to end with this election. It's not going to end with Macron's having only one more term to go. I mean, my theory for quite a while now has been that people say that this is all like it is in Britain, the elite versus the people, the same with Trump and Brexit. I think France is more complicated. I've identified France having split, having once been the country that invented left versus right, but France is now split into 3 big groups, essentially. I've been arguing for a while, it's split into 3 big groups: a big far-right group, a centre pro-European consensual moderate group built around Macron to a large extent, and the left, a very scattered left. And if you look at the way, if you count the votes in the first round last Sunday week, about 32% voted for the left, one way and another, mostly for Mélenchon. About 32% voted for Macron, what was left of the old pro-European centre-right in terms of Pécresse, and about 32% for the far-right if you include Le Pen, Zemmour, and another small far-right candidate. So 3-way split, absolutely down the middle. The last 2 or 3 points goes to a man called Jean Lassalle, who I don't think anyone can identify whether he's left, right, or what he is. So basically the country is divided in 3 ways, and I think that will continue. And I think that the danger is, I think that's why Macron will win in a sense on Sunday, because if you take those 3 tribes, he doesn't have enough votes to win on Sunday unless he gets votes from somewhere else. They'll come from the left, because enough of the left won't want to vote for the far right to put Marine Le Pen in power. The parliamentary elections are more complicated. I can come back to that in a second. But he will be essentially a president who's been elected with 1/3 of the vote of the country genuinely behind him, and he'll have, I think, a very difficult second term, as he's had a very difficult first term. And I think the danger in the next 5 years, when as he is president, is that the far right group will not strengthen and consolidate behind Marine Le Pen. She'll be defeated. I think that will probably be the end of her as a serious politician in France. I think that her party will gradually fall apart. I think Eric de Zemmour, even though he was defeated this time very badly, and Marine Le Pen's niece, Marion Maréchal, who switched to the Zemmour camp, will emerge as the great strong figures on the far right, and they will try and pull in, and will succeed in pulling in, a lot of what's left of the centre-right family in France. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about the first round election is that the Parti Socialiste, I think Assa already mentioned this, which was in power until 5 years ago, got less than 2% of the vote. The Les Républicains, which is the successor of de Gaulle, of Sarkozy, of Chirac, got, I think, less than 5% of the vote. So between them, they got about under 7% of the vote. Imagine it would be like the Tories in Labour in Britain getting only 7% of the vote between them. I know that already happens in Scotland, but I'm talking about Britain. It would be like the Republicans, not the Republicans, and Democrats in America getting only 7% of the vote between them. In French terms, that is already an extraordinary fact. And that's not going to change. Those 2 parties are dead. They're going to disappear. Macron will take bits of both of them, already has taken bits of both of them and create a bigger centrist movement. Who will run that movement after Macron goes is open to question. Maybe that will fall apart as well. So I foresee there being not a threat to Europe from this election. I mean, John described very well what the threat would be, and it would be an enormous threat if Le Pen got in power. That won't happen. But I fear that the 2027 election might be a much greater and more powerful threat to France in Europe, and therefore to the existence, the existential survival of the European Union, than this election has been. If you got the big new nationalist right movement that Zemmour and Marion Maréchal want to create, probably with Marion as the head of it rather than Zemmour, because Zemmour, I think, has somewhat made a fool of himself this time. That could be more successful than Le Pen's ever been. And I can imagine that movement taking power in France in 5 years' time, because there wouldn't be a Macron there. The centre movement might start to fall apart. The left will remain as scattered as ever. I think the next election is a scary election, not this one. That's it.
Thank you very much, John. You just booked your place in in our webinar in 2027, and I hope we'll all be around. Certainly you and me. Anyway, I don't know about me. Anyway, no, that was thank you very much. That was very incisive and very interesting indeed. So, anyway, we're now going to move directly to Europe, I suspect, and with David O'Sullivan. David, well, I gather from your various sort of CVs that you speak 6 languages. Oh man, I mean, this is pretty good, including Japanese, which is extremely impressive, that's to say the least. I mean, I think Mr. Henley speaks about 4, don't you, John? John, I think, speaks quite a lot. Assa, do you speak Scots now as well as English? No. Anyway.
I don't, unfortunately, but hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon, exactly. Me too. Anyway, well, so anyway, but you're David. You've been former Director General for Trade at the European Commission, Secretary General of the Commission. You were at one point chef de cabinet to Romano Prodi. You were Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service, which you set up, and you were the ambassador to Washington. And now, inter alia, you've still got many other things you do. I don't know where you find time. Anyway, you now, as I said earlier, you're now the new head of the of Ireland's Institute for International and European Affairs. So you're very well placed to tell us what on earth this vote on Sunday is going to mean for Europe. Is it going to be, I mean, John Lichfield suggested not as serious this time round, but maybe in 5 years' time. What's your take? I mean, given the background we don't need to go into of war in the Ukraine, the way in which the EU has responded, Europe as a whole has responded to that. And obviously, a new government which is not entirely beloved in or suggested to be kind of strong or as stable as one might hope in Berlin. We've just had John was talking about Hungary. We just had Viktor Orban re-elected for a 4th term now, unbelievable in Hungary. So, what's your take on what's going on?
Well, thank you very much, David. And as somebody once said, everything has been said, but not yet by everybody. So I'm very much in agreement with everything that's been said by John Henley, by Assa, by John Lichfield. I mean, on the French elections, I have nothing to add. I think it is likely that Macron will win. I tend to agree with John Lichfield that it could even be in double figures. But I entirely agree with John that I think looking forward, what should worry us is 2027. What comes next? Because as John Henley and Assa have described, and John Lichfield also makes this point. What we're witnessing is the collapse of the traditional parties. By the way, this is not unique to France. It's happening in many countries in Europe, with the exception perhaps of Germany. The worrying thing is what happens in France over the next 5 years. And I think this will be very important. We also, I mean, what also will happen in the assembly elections, of course, in June will be important, where clearly Macron is not going to succeed as he did 5 years ago in having a majority for his newly created party. I don't think it'll be that difficult for him to put together some kind of reasonable majority, which will not depend on Le Pen's supporters, but he is going to have to compromise. And I do agree with Assa's description of, which is a common phenomenon. I mean, we witness it in the US. I think we're seeing it many places in Europe, which is the sense of the left behind, the people feeling that the economic system is not delivering for them. I mean, actually, the objective economic facts in France are pretty good at the moment. Really. But, you know, there is this consistent feeling that there is a group of people who are left behind, a lack of investment in public infrastructure. It is exactly what you had with the Brexit vote. Right? No investment in the NHS, no investment in public transport, no investment in education, which meant that the immigration looked worse because people felt it was the immigration that was deteriorating the public services. In fact, it was the lack of investment. We have a common problem across Europe of a lack of investment in public services, and this is reflected then, I think, in a disenchanted vote. What is interesting, and I think for your Scottish participants, is nonetheless the tendency is not to blame Europe, and it's very interesting that the far right across Europe have had to take anti-EU out of their program by and large. Because it's not a vote getter. Saying you want your country to leave the EU or you want to leave the Euro doesn't win you many votes anywhere in Europe. And all the far right parties have actually started to take this out. Now, with Marine Le Pen, as John Henley very clearly pointed out, it's a facade, it's an artifice, because in practice, she's trying to tear up the treaties. But nonetheless, she cannot full frontally say, I want to take France out of the European Union, because that isn't a vote getter. And I think that popular sentiment of a gut feeling of support for the European Union will carry us through in many parts of Europe over the next period, because there is still a deep attachment. Even you take Poland, where we're in major confrontation between Brussels and the Polish government, but they also draw back from saying they want to leave the European Union because they know that would not go well. Orban, again, more tricky, I agree. Now, what I just wanted to touch upon, in addition to what's already been said, is just a little bit, you know, where are we also in terms of the even bigger picture of the war in Ukraine, the confrontation with Russia, the United States, because the tectonic plates are shifting big time. And, you know, we are witnessing something which I think none of us would ever have imagined we would see in our lifetime, David. When you and I were together in Brussels, you know, we assumed that peace was the order of the day, and preserving it would not prove too difficult. We had, of course, the horrors of the Balkans, but it was a slightly more limited regionalized context, right? I mean, we also had an ongoing war in Northern Ireland, but I mean, again, it was seen as something which was explained by local circumstances. It was not a return to the First and Second World War. We're now witnessing something much closer to that, right? The invasion of a sovereign country by Russia, and warfare, which is in many ways deliberately targeting civilians as much as fights between military. Horrendous stuff. This is going to change the landscape. This is going to change the way we look at the world. Because I don't know how long the war in Ukraine is going to last, but I do know that this confrontation with Russia is probably said to last 5-10 years. And this is going to dramatically change the global order. The US is another key point in all of this. We're very lucky to have President Biden in the White House at this particular point in time. I wouldn't want to even think about what the situation would be if we'd had Mr. Trump back. Mr. Biden has shown great leadership, and particularly the team around him has really managed this very well without the usual American arrogance of just telling allies what they have to do, full of consultation, actually listening to European allies in terms of strategy, holding together an alliance. But frankly, this administration is not happy because their focus is not Russia, it's China. And they're going to want to get back to dealing with China at some point. So we in Europe have to draw some consequences for ourselves from this, because we are going to have to take more responsibility for our own management of this conflict that is now with us for some time to come. We are going to have to spend more on defense. We're going to have to do more joint work on defense. We're going to have to, it will be fully compatible with NATO, which will remain the cornerstone of territorial defense for all our member states. But frankly, the Americans are going to say, hey, you Europeans, you need to do more. We've got something else going on over here in the Indo-Pacific, and we're not going to be holding your hand the whole time, distracting from our main agenda. And this is going to have a serious consequence for the European Union. We are missing the UK, of course, in this, which is a great tragedy. I mean, I always felt that the loss of the UK would be felt at its greatest in the security and defense area, and so it proves to be. Of course, we can try and cooperate with the UK, but it's much more difficult to do that with the UK outside of the EU than it would be if they were inside. We will try to find ways of doing it, but we basically have a government in London which frankly doesn't like even admitting the EU exists still, not to mention actually wanting to cooperate with them. So there are going to be obstacles there that will have to be overcome. But I think in all of this is also going to affect the way we work together. Look at what is happening in Germany. You said, David, that when I said I thought the center was holding better in Germany, you sort of shook your head. I agree that the CDU has fallen behind, but I mean, remarkably, we actually had a left-wing victory. I think Germany must be about one of the few countries in Europe where the left wing, you know, there is a strong left wing, which has come to power. Which is part of the problem, by the way, across all of Europe, has been the collapse of the liberal left as we knew it, and it has not been replaced by something that the voters feel comfortable with, which is interesting because Macron's biggest support comes from the older people, not from the younger people. And as Assa, who probably is one of those younger people herself, said, many of her friends, you know, don't feel they can vote for Macron. They don't necessarily want to vote for someone awful like Le Pen, but we have this problem, and I think the Germans in particular, in having to rethink entirely their Russia policy, including the dependence on energy, are going to want to do this in a European context. The Germans are not going to want to spend 100 billion extra on defense purely on a German army, I can assure you, because nobody else in Europe is going to feel very comfortable with that either. So they are going to want to do this within a European context. And this is going to add a completely new dimension to the work of the European Union in the years to come. So I think we have this very complex situation, which is the nature of the European Union. And this is my final point, where, you know, yes, we are building something like a federal state, but it is not a federal state. And the national realities of each country still remain predominant. And therefore, you know, you can put the French election in a European context, but ultimately it's a French election, right? It's about the French people voting for how they feel about their daily lives. And this is the same, is replicated across every country in Europe. But at the same time, you have the changes that we're witnessing. Finland, Sweden about to join NATO, a referendum in Denmark on the 1st of June that nobody's talking very much about, but to take out the opt-out from European defense cooperation that they had in the Lisbon Treaty. So they want to get more involved in European defense policy, a debate here in Ireland about our neutrality and our military non-alignment. So, you know, there are conflicting tendencies, if you like, which how it will play out over the next few years. You can build a case for saying Europe will be stronger and more integrated. You can also build a case to say that it will be more difficult to find agreement at European level, and there will be a weakening of the European Union. My money, the smart money, is on a strengthening of the European Union, because at the end of the day, that is what has always delivered better outcomes, but nothing is guaranteed. And certainly the election in France, and in particular, as John said, the fact that this is a sort of the second in a triptych of elections which will determine the future of French politics, with 2027 being a very pivotal moment, this is going to determine as well whether France remains at the heart of the European Union with Germany in that famous motor, or whether France takes a different direction. I don't believe it will, but I think the odds, it's not excluded that things could get very difficult.
Thank you very much, David. Yeah, for that excellent analysis of where we're at. I should say, when I shook my head about the German parties, as I was thinking back to the days in which the Volkspartei, the two big tent parties, effectively won well over 80% of the vote, and of course that no longer is the case. I was the correspondent in Germany in the early 90s, and even then there was a huge big number. Anyway, voila. But can I just ask the rest of the panel what do they think in reaction to what David was saying about how far do they think, bearing in mind, John, because you may have to go, I think, at some point, the prospects for for Europe to play this bigger role. I mean, Europe is trying to box its way precisely, it seems to me, between, on the one hand, an America until recently very much focused on the Indo-Pacific, as David was saying, and China in particular, and these two big, huge powers, and Europe trying to kind of provide a kind of alternative pole, if you like. Not Russia, I hasten to add. Russia not being seen as a sort of second division player, despite its nuclear arsenal. Anyway, what do you think, John?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, David. I mean, it's one thing we haven't addressed, which is Macron winning on Sunday, which I believe he will, will make him probably the big player in the EU in the next 5 years, in the next 2 years. I mean, in a sense, what's happened, which in Ukraine is a sort of indication of many of the things Macron has been saying since he was elected and before he was elected about the need for Europe to start to think strategically, to grow a brain, to act in the world not just as a sort of big economic power, but something that thinks ahead about its place in the world and doesn't rely entirely on America for its defense or for its foreign policy either. A lot of which was people accept some of it and criticize other parts of it. But Macron's been ahead of the game in some ways, and I think he will, if elected, which I think he will be one of the great shapers of the kinds of things that David O'Sullivan was describing just now, which are going to face Europe in the next 5 years. I think you can criticize Macron, you can be angry by Macron, you can be irritated by Macron, but he's a man who thinks quite deeply. He doesn't always express himself in a way that people find acceptable, but I think he's an important figure to have around the next 4 or 5 years. There aren't many other people who have thought as deeply about the problems David was describing as Macron has, and who have the credibility that Macron has in that area. So I think he will be an important figure in the next 5 years in shaping whatever the European Union decides to do. I think I agree with David. I think that this idea of a European defence policy, which seemed to be just a sort of dead end for so long, has suddenly the gates have opened, and the possibility for that now is a great one. But it's not an easy one either. I mean, the French, I think, have a particular interest in that because they are probably still the greatest defence power within the European Union, and they also have a military industrial interest in it, and there's a lot of suspicion of them for those two reasons. So there are going to be a lot of complications within the EU in the next 5 years, but I think having Macron there as a sort of thinker is going to be an important asset to the EU.
Yeah, I agree. Assa, have you got any thoughts on this? Speaking as a young French person.
Yeah, I think Europe is definitely one of Macron's strongest suits. I think this is something that really put him forward back in 2017. He really had this whole vision, this whole discourse on Europe, and I think that seduced quite a lot of voters in 2017. And I think he's tried to play on that again for this election, especially with the war in Ukraine going on. And as we said in this discussion, he's someone who really wants Europe to think strategically and have really a voice on the world stage. So I think if he's reelected on Sunday, this is something that is going to push really hard over the next 5 years. And with the crisis that we've experienced over the past 5 years, this is something that he's pushed really hard as well. For example, if you look at economic measures, for example, to make sure that Europe gets back on track after COVID, this is something that he wanted to re-implement at European level. And he really has this vision where Europe is not only, as we said, a market, but a place where we are able to, show the way for the world, and also protect citizens. So I think he's trying to combine different ideas of what Europe could be, and I think he's doing it very articulately.
Yeah, John Henley, Dennis McShane, an old sort of, Europe watcher, as it were, an actor, says that Macron will face big domestic problems in the next 5 years. Not sure he thinks he won't command support from other EU leaders, coping with an angry, divided France without any intermediaries. Is that your view? I mean, what do you think the prospects are for working particularly on strategic autonomy, as it's known, with the Germans, and for reforming the kind of the way in which Europe acts economically?
Well, that's very
I'm very keen on changes to the stability.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, actually. I mean, I think Dennis is quite. I mean, I think there is quite a high risk of some quite serious domestic, protests in France if and when Macron is re-elected. As Assa said, there's a lot of unhappy people. And as John said in one recent piece, France is an angry country, and there are plenty of reasons for French people to be angry at the moment. And so I think there is quite a strong risk. I mean, if you just look, for example, at the Gilets jaunes protest that sort of brought large parts of France to a halt for a while a couple of years ago, started with a because of fuel prices that were then substantially lower than they are at the moment, and Macron has stepped in with subsidies and what have you, but the potential is very clearly there for, particularly if people feel they're not represented. But just coming back to your point about I think that what will be absolutely key over the coming years is Macron's relationship with Scholz, and the how. The kind of overtures that Macron made to Germany when he was elected 5 years ago. I mean, the way in which, for example, maybe not half his cabinet, but 3 or 4 senior members of his initial cabinet were German speakers, and there was a clear, a real sort of desire to sort of kickstart the Franco-German motor in. And obviously he ran into problems because Merkel was, I don't know whether you want to call her a lame duck chancellor, but she was clearly, her room for maneuver was limited. And I just don't think we know enough yet about Scholz, about how, his speech, his sort of, this sort of changing of the epoch sort of speech straight after the start of the invasion of Ukraine, looked like a really big European moment. But I think he's shown himself to be quite reluctant on a lot of the things, a lot of the measures that are sort of being asked of him. There's kind of quite a groundswell of opinion in Europe that I'm getting that is, that it's a bit rich of Germany to have expected Greece to have made all those sacrifices and not be prepared to make any sacrifices for that, something that matters as much as Ukraine. And I think just generally Macron's capacity to persuade Germany to loosen these, Eurozone fiscal rules, and as you were saying, David, is going to be absolutely critical. And I'm not convinced. As to how far Germany is prepared to budge on that. You're muted.
I know. Listen, trying to do multitask. Well, actually, yeah. On that point, what do you think, David, yourself, David O'Sullivan? That is, how far Well, somebody's asked a question about the legacy of Angela Merkel here in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, but you might also question to some extent the legacy of Angela Merkel in terms of Europe as a whole. Actually, I'm not quite so. I'm personally never quite shared the huge kind of almost she can do no wrong kind of attitude that a lot of people had towards her personally. But anyway, what's your own feeling about the prospects for yet another revival of the Franco-German tandem or locomotive?
Well, yeah, there is a certain amount of revisionism going on about Mrs. Merkel. I mean, I remain, with a lot of admiration for how she handled some very difficult situations. And I think her decision to admit the refugees in 2015 was a remarkable act of statesmanship, incredible. And she did avert a major crisis. And actually, she did nudge Germany along, particularly during the Euro crisis, into finally a solution, which was to everyone's benefit. So, her weakness, of course, the weakness of all of us, frankly, was, to, I'm not even going to use the word appease, but to think that somehow we could manage Putin, right? So in 2008 with Georgia, we tried to sort of calm things down. Even Crimea, we kind of said, okay, right, a few sanctions, not more than a few sanctions, but no major confrontation because we think we can manage this. And the dependence on the gas, well, I mean, a lot to be said. Germany, classically has suffered from a shortage of no direct access to energy. Russia has been the only place it could go because the UK and the US at various stages in the last century kept Germany away from the traditional sources of energy. So there's a whole history there. And many of us believed, I'm a former Director General of Trade, many of us believed that countries that traded and were economically interdependent were less likely to go to war, right? So, many of us thought that, and Mr. Putin has proven us wrong. So, okay, mea culpa from all of us. For the future, look, it can go wrong, but my instinct is that the Franco-German engine will revive. I think the Germans, there is a major change happening in Germany. It's slow. I take the point about, switching off the gas and the oil immediately. People say, oh, you can manage it. Not so easy, frankly, from where they are today. But they will get there. They are started down the road now of reducing and ultimately eliminating dependence on Russian gas. They are going to have big military expenditure. They're not going to want to do that on their own. And so I think the net result of this debacle in Ukraine will be a further strengthening of the role of the European Union, driven by a Franco-German motor. Now, there will be many obstacles. There will be many difficulties, and not just in France and Germany. So it's never a simple process, right? The process of integration. But there's a phrase in French, la tendance lourde, and the underlying trend. And the underlying trend remains that more often than not, the answer to some of our biggest problems lies in Europeans working together rather than going their separate ways. And I think that logic will be reinforced by what we're witnessing today.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, yeah, indeed, a sentiment that many of us in this side of the border would wholly endorse. Anyway, can I just revert a bit to French politics into domestic politics now? Because there's quite a few people asking questions about, well, a couple of things. First of all, about young people and why a lot of young people have been attracted to MLP, as she's known, Le Pen, but also related to that, what is actually? I mean, there's a lot of analysis about that, which John, for example, gave us about what her policies are and what she stands for, but what's the Macron offer, Assa, to young people, but not just the young people, but to the French electorate as a whole over the next 5 years?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I think so when you look at the demographics of the Marine Le Pen vote and the Marine Le Pen support, it turns out it's my generation, so the 30-somethings who are supporting Marine Le Pen the most. I think it's because my generation, I feel, can really feel the squeeze of the cost of living crisis. So we're trying to have a roof over our heads. The rents are insane. taxes, finding work can be difficult. And I think a lot of people are looking for radical solutions and are seduced by that kind of rhetoric that she's putting forward, which I think is quite interesting, is that the generation just before mine, so people aged between 18 and 25, in this election have really strongly supported Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has also this kind of very radical rhetoric, but obviously not, you know, the same propositions. For example, he says that we need, actually Marine Le Pen says that as well, we need to actually block the prices for, you know, first necessity products, for example, I don't know, pasta, soap, you know, the things we all need. And I think that these are very concrete measures that kind of resonate with people, and they kind of feel that, oh, this is something that would really, really change my life. As for Macron, I think for people in my demographic, I think he offers a vision of a country that is more open, with more opportunities, with less constraints as well, where it's probably easier to maybe switch between jobs, to have a better work-life balance. And I think this resonates with people. But at the same time, one of his big propositions this campaign is to push the retirement age to 65. And the only people, yeah, I mean, for a lot of Europeans, a lot of people would say, well, what is the big, you know, controversy about it? But in France, it is a very, very sensitive and inflammatory debate. And the only voters who are in favor of this measure are those who are already retired, because they're not going to be affected by it. So obviously, you know, while you have some support, I wouldn't say, so obviously Marine Le Pen is quite supported in my generation, but Emmanuel Macron comes just after her. So there's still quite a lot of support for people under the age of 45. But at the same time, this measure to push the retirement age is quite controversial. I think a lot of people think, well, it's already quite hard enough to find work. So if we push the retirement age, isn't it going to be more difficult to enter the job market? So this is a big debate that's happening at the moment.
Well, of course, John, I'm just going to move to you, John Henley, that is. Of course, many of us find the notion of raising the retirement age to, 65 is a kind of, just goes without saying, obviously, especially brothers like John Lichfield and myself, still at it, I'm in my late 70s now, I mean, what's the problem? I mean, carry on working till one drops. Anyway, John, you're a relatively young person still. What do you think?
Relatively, yes. No, I agree entirely with what Assa said. But I was just going to say, I think there is and I noticed that somebody posted a question about this in the Q&A quite early on, if there isn't a kind of a systemic issue going on here as well. And I fully agree with what John Lichfield said about these three, the potential danger of these three blocks, and maybe just add that the worst, it seems to me, danger of these three blocks in terms of this specific situation with Macron and this big sort of the centrist bloc that hopefully he will command, is that the two other blocks are both popular. I mean, he's being assailed by populists from both sides, basically, which seems to me a very dangerous situation to be in. And but I just wanted to say just a word to respond to the person who asked the question about, is the system delivering? When, as Assa described so eloquently, you've got people being forced to make choices that they really don't want to make. And even if, making choices is obviously the whole business of democracy, it becomes dangerous when you're asking people for the third time in a row to vote for somebody that they would really rather not vote for. And I think there is a question, and I don't know whether, I don't know, I'd really like to know what John Lichfield has to say about this, but it does seem to me that there's a problem in France that you have this kind of every 5 years. It used to be every 7 years, now every 5 years, this kind of like all or nothing presidential election, where people are forced to choose, but where the whole nation kind of pins their hopes and their hates on one individual who inevitably is not going to. And on top of that, you have a parliament that is not really you know, the sort of the balance isn't, you know, it isn't, there aren't really the checks and balances in the French system. The president is too powerful, the parliament is too weak, there isn't enough proportional representation, there isn't there are just an awful lot of French people who once again after this election are going to feel that they are not represented by in their country's political system. And I think that's a long-term systemic threat that, you know, Macron would do very well to it. I mean, he did say in 2017 that he was going to look straight away at proportional representation. Nothing came of it. But I think that there will need to be some kind of shake-up of the system if the awful scenario that John was painting earlier isn't going to come to pass.
Yes, David O'Sullivan, you were going to say something. Yeah.
No, just very quickly, because I know you want to get to other questions, but to that point, I don't disagree with John on his comment on France's democratic system. Honestly, I think it's a complaint with all our democracies. You have it in the UK in spades, frankly. I mean, people are talking about Mr. Macron getting elected, you know, president with sort of 30-something% of the vote, and you have a Tory government that got in with, you know, 37% of the vote and 80-seat majority, right? So clearly something doesn't work there either. And it is, I think this problem that in all our countries, after every election, there are quite a lot of people who don't feel represented. And this, in my view, is highly corrosive.
Yeah.
What worries me is more generally the state of democracy across Europe, and by the way, the United States, particularly the United States as well. That there are a growing number of people who are thinking this democracy doesn't work. Maybe we need something else. And of course, they mean something else democratic. But honestly, this flip from that to something which is very distinctly not democratic, which we can see happen, is not such a big step, unfortunately. And that worries me deeply for the future of the democracies. If we take Mr. Biden's division of the world into democracies and autocracies, and you know, a lot of gray zones there, but I think that should worry us all. Which is, how do we demonstrate to people that democracy, liberal democracy, if I may use that phrase, is the best political system for the vast bulk of people, as opposed to, you know, the false promises of more autocratic, strong leader systems, and that's something we should worry about.
I would just say here on a slightly tangential point, actually, that tell that to the Scots, because we certainly didn't vote for Brexit, and nor actually does Boris Johnson's run very large in this neck of the woods. Anyway. Can I just go back to the domestic side on France, which you know, we're coming towards the end, and I don't know, John, if you still have to go to this.
I need to go very soon. Yeah, so maybe if I could answer the first question and then leave, that would be. That would be
great. I was just going to say that, right? So a lot of people are asking questions about, first of all, how the system in the you know, the élections parlementaires, how that actually works, and how much. I think it's sort of, John's already talked a bit about the lack of proportionality in it, but also I mean, they're going to be in June, or could they be brought forward? There's some suggestion they might be brought forward, and what's the likely outcome? I mean, and what kind of, could we have a kind of system of going back to cohabitation, or, you know, back to in the past?
Well, I could speak for an hour about that, but I can't. So nor would you want to hear me. Well, yeah, it's June the 12th and June the 19th. The French have. Poor old Brenda from Bristol, if she was in France, would be sort of living through a nightmare for election days in the space of a few weeks. Yeah. So yes. Well, the way the system works is quite interesting, because in the first round, you can, like a first round of the presidential election, you get lots and lots of different candidates. But the second round of the parliamentary election is not just two candidates. It's a very complicated formula for those who can stay, depending on what percentage of the not just the people who vote, but the people who are registered to vote. If you get above a certain percentage, you can stay in the second round. So you can get 3 candidates, 4 candidates, even in some rare occasions elections, 5 candidates fighting in the second round, and the second round becomes just like a British parliamentary election. It's first past the post. So you can win a constituency with much less than 50% of the vote in France, which is what will save Macron, I think, because I think the right and the far right are going to be so shattered and scattered this time that his various little formations that are going to support Macron, not just his own party, will, I think, gather, as someone else said, a working majority out of this election. But I think that what may happen this time, you might get a strong alliance of the left for the first time. I think Mélenchon's success, which was partly, as Assa said, partly a kind of Trump Day success because the people voting for him weren't all very strongly Mélenchon fans, but it's given him a strong position in which to assert his parliamentary elections. So I can imagine the left getting quite a big block of votes and becoming the opposition to Macron in the next parliament. The far right, I think, because they're still very divided poisonously divided between Zemmour and Le Pen supporters, will probably not get that many seats, I suspect. And so you're going to have a parliament which will be somewhat unbalanced in that respect, but with a big bloc supporting Macron, quite a big left-wing bloc, and then a far-right bloc which is smaller than the real support for the far-right in the country, which is dangerous. There ought to be a more proportional system than it is. Macron's talking of introducing it, but he said that last time as well. Is it in his interest to do so? Maybe it is, I don't know. So yeah, it is a very complicated system. I think I'm not one of those who think that Macron will not get a majority. In all the years of the Fifth Republic, the French electorate, which is extremely perverse at times, has never denied a recently elected president a majority in the following parliamentary election. And I don't think they will this time. Had Le Pen won, were she to win, that might be different because it would be very difficult for her to get a majority. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think Macron will get his majority in June. I have to leave now. I'm very sorry, but it's been very, very interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, John, and safe journey to Caen and back.
Yes.
Back.
All right. Bye, everyone.
And best wishes to Margaret.
Bye, John.
Okay.
Bye. Sorry, I'm being personal there. That's his wife, obviously. Assa, what do you think about the kind of the parliamentary elections and what that will mean?
So yeah, the parliamentary election is, I think a lot of people find it confusing, and actually, people concentrate a lot and focus a lot of their attention on the presidential election, and turnout is much lower always for the parliamentary election. But even if France has a presidential regime, the president can't do much if they don't have a working majority. So this is hugely important, and yeah, it's a funny system. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining how it works, but there's this story of like 12.5% of, if you get 12.5% of the votes, basically, you can go to a second round. So you can have a second round with 3, even 4 candidates sometimes. Yeah. So yeah, some people don't really understand how it works. So yeah, John talked about kind of an alliance of the left for this election. So Jean-Luc Mélenchon opened the door to an alliance, especially with the Greens, but explicitly said, I'm going to do an alliance with everyone except the socialists. So Jean-Luc Mélenchon used to be a member of the Socialist Party until, I can't remember exactly when, I think it was 2008, and then he left to create his own party, and he's always kept this kind of rancor towards the left. And this is quite typical, I would say, of the left in France. Sometimes, the parties and the politicians just cannot get over past, past drama, basically. And they tend to find ways not to unite, which could cost them a lot, I would say. But then I know he's supposed to be on television tonight. He's probably speaking at the moment. I know the leader of the Socialist Party, the first secretary, Olivier Faure, really is crossing his fingers to hear Mélenchon say, actually, after the result of the first round, it would probably be a good idea to just all unite and see how we would do in the parliamentary elections. But what's interesting in this election as well is that between the first and the second round, you have parties and candidates negotiating to see, what would be the best strategy going forward. So this is always a good moment of, a great moment of compromise, which I think is quite unusual in French politics.
Yeah, good. David O'Sullivan, in your own country, of course, there's somebody who's asking a question about when I say your own country, I don't mean Belgium, I mean Ireland. I was asking a question about whether the kind of polarization in France is symptomatic of other countries. And of course, you might also add fragmentation as well, political fragmentation. These two sort of phenomena exist coexisting. And of course, in Ireland. So how does Ireland view the elections in France and indeed in Germany? Actually, I mean, what's its take? Where does it stand now with regard to Europe and the prospects for Europe?
Well, I mean, the general Irish view about the EU is extremely positive. I mean, the Eurobarometer polls, the numbers are up in the sort of 85 to 90% approval of EU membership, and have been for the last 4 or 5 years. So I think what Irish people want out of elections in other countries is stability and reasonable government. So I think people will be horrified at the idea that Mrs. Le Pen could get elected, not just because it would disrupt the EU, but as Assa and John have said, it's a fundamentally xenophobic, nasty, racist agenda, which is playing to the worst of all our instincts. This is deeply worrying, that the people of that nature can get those kind of votes in countries across Europe. I think in Ireland, as you know, we've also had, following the great economic crisis and the bailout and all that went with it, a certain implosion of the centre parties, and Fianna Fáil, the traditional party of government in Ireland, collapsed, is now in coalition with its once greatest enemy, right, Fine Gael. They were the two. They were the two sort of Mutt and Jeff of Irish politics, and Sinn Féin is rising. Largely on, I think it's very important to say, largely on the back of fairly bread and butter issues like housing, healthcare, not so much on the sort of nationalist agenda. Frankly, I don't think many of the younger people voting for Sinn Féin are not in the slightest bit interested in the what we call the national issue here, but rather concerned about the fact that they can't get a house, that it's difficult to rent accommodation, that infrastructure is not keeping pace with public investment in infrastructure, is not keeping pace with the cost of living, and so on. So the traditional issues, but there's a similar problem of the weakening of the traditional parties. The Labour Party, the party of the left, had a flowering, but then has fallen back. The Green Party has done quite well, but they've gone into coalition with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and are suffering the fate of all small parties who go into coalition with bigger parties, which is they may get some items of their agenda put through, but they pay a heavy electoral price at the exit, because people feel they betrayed their base electorate. So, Ireland is not exempt from some of these trends.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, John, final thoughts, John Henley, about France in the next 5 years.
Yeah, well, a final thought, I guess, is that I think what's complicating this election, particularly, which we haven't really raised at all, is Macron's personality. And he's perceived in France as having, he was largely elected by the left, and he's perceived as having swung quite sharply to the right during his time in office. He's also come across as, he can also come across as quite arrogant, quite disdainful, quite Jupiterian, as they say. And and that is, and also, of course, he's a former merchant banker. He's so against the, I think it was David who said, the sort of economic fundamentals are really, some are quite spectacular in France. I mean, he in terms of what Macron has achieved in slashing unemployment, in raising spending power, all these kind of things. France, statistically, you know, France is better off. The trouble is that, as Assa was saying very, you know, very rightly, there are a lot of people who don't yet feel that in their pocket. And what we're seeing, I think, in France is that it's a very complicated election because of this personality issue, because of the baggage that Le Pen has, and also because, as well as these three blocks that John was talking about, we're seeing a very clear kind of divide on the in the politics of it, on the kind of fundamental principles of it, between you know, on the one hand, a kind of liberal, relatively progressive, pro-European, globalist, kind of centrist for philosophy, and a you know, it's this classic sort of people from somewhere and people from nowhere kind of thing. And on the other hand, you know, a populist, anti-European, nationalist, protectionist instinct, and that's what's playing out on this, you know, very complex kind of checkerboard that we're looking at over the next few days.
Okay, Assa, you want to say a final word?
Yeah, just one last thing. I think it's very important to say tonight for people to understand really the mood of just sheer tiredness, I would say, about politics and the elections in France, is that both candidates have theorized really this kind of confrontation. So Marine Le Pen has said for ages now, this is going to be, there's no right and left. There is the side of patriots and the side of globalists. And then you have Emmanuel Macron, who said you have the side of reason and the side of fanatics and extremists. So I think a lot of people just look at that and say, oh, they've called the election even before it happened. So why should I just be interested in it? It's not about me at all. So politics all of a sudden becomes this like big confrontational thing, really a culture war, essentially. And I don't think this is a very good place for any modern democracy to be.
There is a wonderful German word to describe that. It's called Politikverdrossenheit, and it is the state of being pissed off with politics, or state of being fed up with politics. And I think it kind of, I actually got it into a Guardian headline many years ago. Anyway. But on the other hand, if we have such interesting panelists as we had tonight, I don't see how we can be, you know, we can suffer any kind of verdruss with au contraire. It's been a fascinating round of exchanges, and I would like, I mean, if the audience were live, I'd ask them to clap, but actually, basically, I can't, so therefore, I will do it myself, you know. And thank you all very much for taking part. It's been absolutely great. And by the way, Assa, your revue écossaise has already won a few subscribers tonight, so well,
thank you.
Certainly won a few fans. So anyway, thank you all very much indeed, and I wish you all the very best. Fingers crossed for Sunday night. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
indeed. Okay. All right. And thanks for the audience for taking part and listening, and for your questions, including the ones we didn't answer. Final thought to all of you, if you're still watching, the next webinar, we will be doing things on refugees, and particularly kind of, you know, the whether we can take more refugees here from Ukraine in particular, but refugees as a whole. And then we will be continuing our series with the on Scotland and Europe, with the politicians from all 5 big parties represented in the Holyrood. And the next one will be the postponed one with Christine Jardine for the Liberal Dems. Okay, thanks very much. Salut, bonsoir. Okay, bye-bye, bye-bye.